It's time for The Verdict. The Verdict is a lively discussion of current events and legal issues pertinent to Oklahomans. The Verdict is hosted by Kent Myers and Mick Cornett. The Verdict is brought to you in part by Betcher, Martin, Jean, and Jackson, when hurt people need help. Betcher, Martin, Jean, and Jackson in Ponca City. It's time for The Verdict.
And welcome once again to The Verdict. I'm Mick Cornett. Our partner here is Kent Myers. He's one of Oklahoma's top legal experts, and today another issue that will turn into a debate of sorts.
It will be a debate, a formal debate actually, a time debate. We have two representatives that are going to visit with us today about the Oklahoma workers' compensation system and whether it's broken or not, and if it is, what should be done to fix it. Just in brief summary, the Oklahoma workers' compensation system provides compensation to workers who were injured on the job, whether it was their fault or not, basically. And the employers have to provide for that through insurance, either bought through private carriers, or if they're in a certain category, they can self-insure themselves. Seems like every year in our legislature, there's a debate about whether the comp system ought to be reformed or not. We're going to be talking today about the issues that seem to be at the forefront of this debate. We're going to be visiting about how the system is handled through workers' compensation courts, and should it continue to be a court-administered system, or should it be more an administrative system? We're going to be talking about the problem of the dueling doctors, where one doctor says, oh gosh, the worker's really hurt, the other doctor says he's not hurt at all, and how that ought to be handled. We're going to be talking about limitations on attorney's fees and whether attorneys ought to be involved in the system. We've got Bob Burke, a well-known author and journalist and all, and I'll introduce him more fully in the next segment, coming to talk on behalf of the workers' compensation system as it is. And we've got Mike Seney from the State Chamber to take the opposite view. I think it should be fun.
It should be. We're discussing workers' compensation in the state of Oklahoma. This is The Verdict, and we'll be right back.
Mike Seney.
Back to The Verdict. Mick Cornett with Kent Myers, and Kent's going to introduce our guests.
We are very pleased today to have two fine guests joining us to discuss the workers' comp system. And just briefly before I introduce them, I want to point out that the answers that they give to questions will be timed, and the response that they give will be timed. So if you see us interrupting them, don't think we're being rude. This is a formally timed debate. Across the table from me is a well-known Oklahoman, Bob Burke. He's a native of Broken Bow, Oklahoma. He is an OU undergraduate and an Oklahoma City University law graduate, a journalist, both locally and with the American Broadcasting Company in New York. He was Governor Boren's Secretary of Commerce during that administration. He's an award-winning author, practices in the Workers' Compensation Court, knows a great deal about it. First appearance on The Verdict. Bob, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Ken. It's nice to be here.
Right next to me is Mike Seney. Mike was born and raised all over as an Air Force child, traveling all over the country, but picked Oklahoma as his place of residence. He's an OU graduate. For the past 12 years, he's been with the State Chamber. He's now the Senior Vice President there at the State Chamber. He was appointed by Governor Walters to a blue ribbon panel on workers' compensation reform and has been on every commission or task force since his first appearance, but we hope not the last again. Mike, thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Mick will ask the first question.
This first question, Mike will have 1 minute to answer, and then Bob would have 30 seconds to respond to Mike's answer. Mike, it's been reported in various studies that Oklahoma's workers' compensation system is one of the most costly in the nation. Do you think that's true? And if so, is that a reason to change the system?
There's no doubt, Mick, that it is one of the most costliest in the nation. If you take a comparison, not of those companies that are insured by private insurance companies or the old state insurance fund, but you take companies that are self-insured, that you're looking at their actual costs of what it costs them in Oklahoma to handle their workers' compensation. They're somewhere between 2 and 3 times higher in Oklahoma than corresponding states where they have similar plants and similar operations. I met last week with a company out of rural Oklahoma that's got 250 employees in a very small community, and they almost lost their plant this last year because they were 3.5 times higher than a similar plant that they had in Kansas. When we're looking at this situation, we have to look at what the basic costs are. In Oklahoma, our costs are simply too high.
Bob?
We're not the costliest in the nation. 10 years ago, we were probably 3rd or 4th highest in the nation. We've made incredible strides in the last 10 years. Mr. Seney and I have been on many reform commissions, including the Fallon Commission on Comp Reform that's almost been 10 years ago now. Most studies now show us between 11th and 16th in the country, although in areas like own risk manufacturing, it is now 50% cheaper than it was 10 years ago. We still have high insurance premiums. We still have high costs, but medical costs of that we'll address later on in the broadcast constitute more than 50% of the entire costs.
Bob, let me ask you a question, kind of following up on your reference to the Fallon Commission. I'm quoting in 1997 from Lieutenant Governor Fallon after significant work was done on the workers' comp system. You were a member of that commission. She said, with the governor's signature, Oklahoma employers and the hundreds of thousands of men and women they employ receive the assurance of a workers' compensation system which is fair to all. That seems to imply that in 97 we fixed it.
We made major fixes in 97. Anyone who has been close to the workers' comp system in the last 10 years will know that the playing field is much fairer now than it was 10 years ago. It is much easier for an employer who has a legitimate defense to a workers' compensation alleged injury to go into court and to win those now, where it was more difficult 10 years ago. In fact, what's happened since the Fallon Commission began working on this process 10 years ago is that our number of claims being filed, even though our workforce is now 200,000 more than 10 years ago, we are at a 24-year low on the number of claims filed in our workers' comp court. Last year, we had only a little more than 17,000 claims filed. That is 10,000 fewer claims filed than just in 1994. So while our workforce is growing in this state, the number of claims are really down significantly.
We did a lot in 95, 96, 97 with the Fallon Commission, but it's interesting, this is not a static system. It changes. It changes a lot because the lawyers are still involved in the system way too much. That's why we had to come back in 2001, and Governor Henry wrote a bill and helped us pass a bill that is also major reform. It's now 3 years later, we've got to look at this again.
Mike, Oklahoma is one of a handful of states that uses a court system to resolve workers' compensation complaints. A lot of other states use an administrative system. Most states use an administrative system. Are we out of step, or should we follow their lead, or should we continue with the system we have?
I think we have to look at what other states are doing on a continuing basis. You cannot take workers' compensation as such an involved process. You can't just take another state's system and their laws and plug it into Oklahoma and say, okay, it'll do the same thing here. But there's no doubt ours is way too litigious. We have way too many lawyers involved in our system. Anything that would administratively streamline this process should be looked at and explored. We have voluntary mediation. We need to figure out ways that we can expand that mediation effort in our process. But whether it's called a court or a referee or an umpire, you take the judges, you take the robes off of them and call them a referee, you're still going to have somebody making that final decision.
Yeah, I agree with Mike on that because it's a matter of semantics. Most of the systems in the country are called administrative, but they may have a person with a robe on making a decision. We happen to call ours the court. 9 of the 10 most expensive programs in the country for administering workers' compensation benefits for employers and insurance companies are administrative systems. For instance, one of the cheapest systems in the country is Nebraska. It happens to join Oklahoma as one of the 3 courts. So what you call them doesn't matter. It's how you control that system that allows the effective flow of sufficient benefits to injured workers.
Bob Burke, Mike Seney, we're discussing workers' compensation in the state of Oklahoma. The debate continues after this. Welcome back to The Verdict. Mick Cornett and Kent Myers hosting a debate on workers' compensation with Mike Seney and Bob Burke. Our question to start this segment is to Mike Seney. Mike, we hear the phrase dueling doctors, in which the company hires a doctor and the worker hires a doctor, and they give conflicting views of severity to the injury. Is that a good system? What do you think of it?
Well, it's not necessarily a good or a bad system. It's just a system that's been around for over 40 years. It only occurs when we're discussing soft tissue injuries, when we're talking permanent partial disabilities, sprains and strains types injuries, because you can't determine objectively what the extent of that injury is. So consequently, you end up with one doctor, the treating doctor, or usually it's a rating doctor for the insurance company saying that this is what the degree of disability is. And then you have the attorney for the claimant get their attorney or their doctor, and they do this again. And then we have the independent medical examiner by the court. This process has cost us literally millions of dollars. And we have got to figure out a way to solve this problem. We have to give more credence to the treating doctor who has seen and worked with that patient to determine what their extent of their disability is. And we also need to use one diagnostic determination. If a person has an MRI done, that MRI should be good for the entire course of that injury for, say, 6 months or a year.
Bob?
Nothing wrong with the dueling doctor system. We have it in every other court. It's a fundamental right in this country that a party ought to be able to call a witness. And what's inherently naive about saying, well, the treating doctor ought to determine how much permanent disability the person has. Well, what if it's the family doctor who's his brother-in-law? Then the insurance company or employer certainly wouldn't want that doctor rating. So even though we do give a lot of credence to a treating doctor's report, especially in surgery cases. However, each party ought to have a right at any time to bring in a witness. That's just fundamentally American Thomas Jefferson ideals.
Bob, you practice in workers' comp court a good bit. There's been talked a lot about a limitation on attorney's fees for the attorney for the injured worker. What do you think about those proposals, and is there a similar limitation on attorneys for the employer?
Well, there's not a limitation for employers, and frankly, the attorney's fee is a myth. There are many people who say they want workers' comp reform who really just want to get lawyers out of the system. Now, it's also a great myth that attorneys are getting a lot of the take. It is an uncontroverted figure. Of the $760 million that was spent by employers and insurance companies in this state last year in workers' comp benefits, only 4% of that money went to claimant lawyers, only 4%. And also, if you cut the attorney's fee, and by the way, it's only 20% of the amount of permanent disability, that is a far less percentage than any other area of the law. And the 20% amounts to only 4% of the total take. And many times I can have hundreds of hours in a case, and I still only get 20%, which, by the way, is very much in the range of attorney's fees allowed in all parts of the country. And an injured worker ought to be able to hire a lawyer, as should an employer.
We're at the part of the discussion now. We're going to let each of our guests.
Oops, we got to let Mike respond.
I'm sorry, Mike.
Especially
please
with that
respond.
line that Bob gave me. I agree absolutely. Bob's right. Those of us that want reform want to get the lawyers out of the system. I think that that's one of the fundamental ways we can reform this system. This workers' compensation is the best example of no-fault insurance in this country. And yet we have way too much litigation in a no-fault system.
Now it's time for us to move to our next part of the show, in which our guests get to ask each other a question. Mike, what's your question for Bob? And then Bob will have an opportunity to respond and ask his question.
As a follow-up to this discussion, since workers' compensation is a no-fault system, why do we have so much litigation involved in it? You say 4% attorney's fees on the system cost, but a lot of people don't realize that the system cost in Oklahoma is $1 billion. 4% is a lot of money.
Well, 10 years ago it was $1 billion. It's now $250 million less, down to about $760 million. But still, that's not a lot of money when it's spread across hundreds and hundreds of lawyers. What I think is that it is naive to think that every employer takes care of its employees. It doesn't happen. Anyone who is an injured worker, anyone who is an employee in this state, there are some employers, and they know that some employers don't take care of their people. So therefore, we always have to have lawyers. It's just like you can't have a no-fault system without some ability for either an employer or an employee to be able to hire an attorney to press an issue, to get something resolved. Again, it's one of those Thomas Jefferson ideals. You ought to have a right in America to have a lawyer.
All right. Bob, won't you pose your question for Mike?
We now know that medical costs constitute more than 50% of that $760 million spent by employers and insurance carriers last year. CWMPs, I want you to explain that to the viewers, but we will never have significant reform unless we cut the costs of medical. How can CWMPs cut that costs?
Certified workplace medical plans is basically managed care for workers' compensation. It was a system set up in 1994 as a result of a blue ribbon panel set up by Governor Walters. It's not used by as many companies as we would like to see it used by, but the results are extremely encouraging. It's case management for serious cases. It's not across the board for every type of case. If you fell against a pillar and hurt your wrist and had to get an x-ray and it was just a medical claim, no problem. You don't even go into the certified workplace medical plans process. But just one company, for an example, in Oklahoma, has increased in the last 3 years, has increased the number of their employees by 22%, has increased their annual payroll by 61%. They have 20 locations around the state, and they've lowered their workers' compensation costs by 19% by using certified workplace medical plans. They will work.
Let's wrap this discussion up by giving each of you a chance to give a closing statement. We have about 1 minute for each of you, and Bob, why don't you go first?
Okay. I think "You're Doing Fine, Oklahoma" is a great description of Oklahoma's workers' comp system. We have 10 judges who, in Oklahoma City and Tulsa, do an efficient and quick job of resolving disputes. Each of those judges handle more than an average of 8,000 docket settings a year. We have an efficient system. That doesn't mean we don't need some fine-tuning. It is a changing system, and we always need some fine-tuning. But it is one of the most efficient systems in the country in handing out workers' compensation benefits for injured workers. Our claims are down dramatically, 38% over 10 years. Our per average claim is down significant. Our costs have gone down, and insurance companies are doing pretty well in the system. Brand new statistics from NCCI, the National Council on Compensation Insurance, just 2-day-old statistics, say that the insurance companies who wrote workers' comp policies in Oklahoma in 2002, which is the year that we have the latest statistics for, wrote $313 million worth of earned premium. But their operating profit, the difference between the amount of premium they earned and their losses paid, was more than $100 million. We are the 14th most profitable state for insurance companies in 2002, all across the nation. So we've had significant reforms.
Just over a minute for you, Mike.
As Bob said, our costs have not gone down, they've gone up. Whether it's medical costs, whether it's the average award, that's gone up. Claims have gone down because we have done some things. The number of claims have gone down because employers are providing safer workplaces, because employees are being trained better in safety. But there are 3 things that we need to focus on, and we have been trying to focus on them for years, and we get blocked every time we do. One is the dueling doctors. It is ridiculous to have 2 medical professionals both swear under oath that one, the employee is 5% disabled, and the other one says he's 35% disabled. Now, is one of them not telling the truth, or is both of them not telling the truth? Something's wrong there. The other area that we have to focus on is the soft tissue injuries. We have people coming back to work doing the same job they were doing before and getting a permanent disability award from a soft tissue injury. We have to fix that problem. That's where our cost drivers are at.
Mike Seney, Bob Burke, thanks for coming on.
Thanks, guys.
Kent and I'll be back with a final word after this.
Way to go.
We are back to wrap up another edition of The Verdict. Today, a debate on workers' compensation.
It is an issue that is really the Energizer Bunny of the Oklahoma legislature. It comes up year after year after year. It's always broken. It's always got to be fixed. It gets fixed, and then it's going to be wonderful, and next year it's broken again. Now, who knows what the real answer is, but these two guests we had today gave us a great insight into some of the issues that we face in getting a system that is fair to all. In that connection, I want to read you a question that's going to be on our website, and I ask you to get on the website and vote yes or no to this question. Would you support a new health and accident insurance system that would protect the worker 24 hours a day, regardless of whether the accident happened on the job or not, and which would require the worker to pay a portion of the premium and a copay or deductible? In other words, take out the workers' compensation system entirely and just put in an accident and health system that would cover the worker all the time, on the job or not. Let us know what you think about that.
And our web address is theverdict.tv. We would invite you to go there and not only check in on that question, but tell us what you'd like to see on a future episode. For Kent Myers, I'm Mick Cornett. We'll see you next time. This is The Verdict.
And now this animal rescue safety tip. Just like people, animals need to see a doctor from time to time.